All right, Hudson here. I know probably a number of people don't know me. I do a lot of Nikon specific videos, but I also work with Sony and Fuji and Canon. And for the last 11 months, I've been working with this Leica Q2. This setup video is going to be really comprehensive. It'll be a little long. You can jump into its full description if you click its title or show more, and you can run down and there's a chaptered out table of contents with clickable links. There's also a scroll bar along the bottom to jump to the part that's most important to you. I'm going to run through this amazing little camera's menu structure and show you all of its settings. I'm going to throw this amazing little rubber lens cap, an accessory I can't be without. There's links in this video's description to accessories that I love to use. You can always run over to my links page and see that stuff. Those links help me out and I appreciate it. But I'm going to go through and show you how to customize your wheel button and your function button to get to up to 16 different menu functions that you want quick access to. I'll show you how to edit your favorites menu. And most importantly, I'll show you how to set up some profiles in this camera so that you can easily, and I'm just making sure I'm recording the back of the screen. Normally when I do these setup videos for new Nikon bodies, I send HDMI out and record the menu structure. But right now I have multiple cameras running from different angles to show you what I'm doing with this camera. But I'll go in the profiles and show you how to quickly set this camera up in up to six different ways that you might instantly want access to in a sudden new shooting environment. Suddenly you want to shoot face and eye detect when you were shooting landscapes a second ago, or maybe there's something moving that you want to track. So we'll talk about all of that. Just really quick for the uninitiated or some of the people I know who are waiting for this video that are more Nikon shooters and like me have adopted carrying this camera around with them as the one that they have all the time. You know, this doesn't replace Nikon for me in any stretch of the imagination, but it's become the camera that I have with me all the time, and I adore it, and I can't imagine being without it. And when the Q3 comes out later this month or next month, by all sounds, I will get one and I'll do one of these videos for that too, and I'll compare and contrast the two. But you know, with the Q2, things are a little bit simpler than with some other cameras, all right? You can get a clean view just by pressing this little button on the back. Whether you're in the viewfinder, whether you're on the back LCD, you can get a little bit of information which you can choose whether you have focus assistance like the horizon line in the histogram here, or you can have all the information. You can change whether you're in full manual mode like I am right now. I have changed my little aperture dial to f1.8. I can down to f1.7 with this amazing 28mm fixed lens, or I can flip it to auto, and now all of a sudden I'm in shutter priority because I have a shutter speed selected up here. If I flip that shutter speed dial to automatic, now all of a sudden I'm in program mode, all right? And what ISO am I at? I'm at auto ISO, which is chosen ISO 6400. If I go into this menu button, we're going to delve into these menus. The first thing that you come to in the menu button is an overview of settings, and it's a touch screen. You can flip into video mode should you desire just by tapping where it says video. You get audio monitor setting there. Go back to photo mode. We're going to focus mostly on photo mode here. And you can change settings that are important to you. You know, you can go into your ISO and say, I don't want auto ISO anymore. I can turn auto ISO off and I can select from 50 ISO all the way up. Oops, I swiped to the right. If I go into my ISO again here, I can choose from 50 all the way up to 50,000. I don't want that ever, but you get the idea. And I can turn auto back on just by tapping the little A there. I've got my focus mode, whether it's locking focus in AFS, which I generally prefer with this camera, or autofocus continuous, simple touch screen button there. I've got what's my autofocus area mode. Am I in a little spot autofocus metering mode or autofocus mode where I just get this super accurate little crosshair I can move about the screen? Or am I instead in this field mode that I generally kind of run with, which is really fast to move around the screen and I can pick up different types of subjects? There's a whole bunch of different ones. We'll talk about those when we go through the menu, but you can quickly access and change that right here. What's my drive mode? Single frame, multi-frame, what speed multi-frame, and I can even go up into intervalometer shooting or exposure bracketing, sort of a la Sony's menu structure, just with moving that button right there. And it's all touchscreen too. You've got, you know, different picture modes. These aren't going to affect your end RAW file if you're shooting in RAW. But you've got standard, vivid, natural. If you're shooting JPEG, these are going to affect your JPEG's output. And also, it's affects how you see the world looking through the camera. You know, if I take this lens cap off, and you'll see my dirty studio here, now we're in black and white mode, right? And we see the world in that black and white mode. And I love looking at the world through this OLED viewfinder in black and white mode, all right? Some things about this camera are a little bit simpler because you have that manual aperture control. Boom, I love to be in aperture priority mode, just choosing what aperture and having an automated shutter speed. You can select shutter speeds in between these full stops on the dial, by the way. Like right now we're at 1 second, and I could take this back dial and change that all the way down to 120 seconds at lower ISOs. If you go up to say 1/8 of a second, I can choose those third stops in either direction just by moving this little back wheel, all right? So that's a really handy thing to note. You've also got manual focus and autofocus, and that's simply by pressing. There's a little place for your finger to rest while you're autofocusing. There's like a little nub to grab on the autofocus dial that makes it really easy, and there's a little button recessed in it. And if you take one finger and put it opposite that button, it's really easy to press the button. I use my index finger. We'll talk about some focusing assist and some manual focus. It's all really simple to jump around with manual controls on this camera. There's a macro mode where you just turn this dial on the back. Most people probably already know that. Let's focus on the menu stuff. So along with, you know, what mode are we in, we'll go back to standard here. You've got profiles. We're going to talk about how to set up these profiles, but right now I'm in a custom profile. You can name these. The profiles I have set in the camera are standard, landscape and panorama, black and white, face and eye detect, action, which is for tracking moving subjects, and custom I can set up however I want. Custom here is my standard mode with the power saver turned off, so I'll just churn through this battery. It'll never time out on me. There's also the default profile, which is basically factory settings, return to factory settings. I rarely ever use that, but it's always there. You can't erase that one. Here we've got what metering mode are we in. I run with multi-field metering for people and specific subjects. It's going to really expose based on what subject you're shooting. It's an evaluative or matrix metering mode for those from the Nikon, Canon, Sony, Fuji world that isn't as worried about highlights as it is about your subject. People complained. They were worried that highlights were blowing out in their images, particularly landscape-focused people like I do a lot of. So in firmware, Leica listened and they added highlight-weighted metering. That's a metering that's really familiar to the matrix shooters with Nikon or evaluative with Sony or Canon. It's going to really try to protect highlights and keep you from blowing those out. So I generally run with highlight weighted for landscapes and multi-field for people. And then you also get, of course, center weighted metering and spot metering like you would with any good camera. White balance. You can go in and choose all your different white balances right here. You can use a gray card. We'll talk about that in a minute. I've got a quick setting for doing that. But you know, auto white balance isn't bad here. What kind of picture are we shooting? DNG is the raw file. You can shoot DNG plus JPEG. I generally shoot DNG with this. They're beautiful files. If I happen to be looking through it and shooting in black and white, I often choose to do DNG plus a large JPEG because the JPEGs that come out of it in black and white are just beautiful. This is for sending photos to the Leica Photos app with your phone. It's a little slow, but it works really, really well and consistently, and it's a great, easy to access way to get photos right from your camera to your phone, or to cull through the photos on your camera and delete the ones that are out of focus or just aren't great while you're sitting having dinner with the camera in your bag. It's pretty awesome. It works quite well. So finally, you can go into the other menus. All right, so let's say we're shooting and we just tap menu. We tap menu again. All of a sudden we go into this favorites. That's the little star menu here. It's like the first page of the menus. This is all customizable. I'll show you how to customize it. I'll show you what I have set in mind though. These are all menu items throughout the other 5 pages, but I want to consolidate them here for easy access. And I have my auto ISO settings. I have my flash settings. I have my video settings, capture assistance, display, and format my memory card. I'll show you what all those are as we go through the menu, and then I'll remind you once again what I put where and why. All right, we hit menu again, we go to page 1. Page 1 has drive mode. That's the same thing we had in our quick menu. When we just hit menu, boom, there it was. Drive mode is right here, so I don't really feel the need to delve into the menus much to go after that. Self-timer. Self-timer is simple. It's either 2 seconds or 12 seconds. I'll show you how I set that up on my wheel button for really easy access. This camera only has 2 custom buttons, the function and the wheel button. However, you can program 8 different functions for each of those that are easily accessible on the fly. I'll show you how to do that. Focusing. This is a deep level menu, has a lot of different settings. So it has what mode, whether you're in autofocus continuous or single servo. I think autofocus continuous with this camera could use a little improvement. It gets great results, but it just feels like version 1.0 a little bit as it's working. Leica hasn't done autofocus for a long time. The single servo mode is just stellar. The only time I really use AFC is sometimes with eye detect tracking and with the tracking mode where it's tracking action. Focus mode for video. AFC, I don't really use autofocus on this camera with video. I don't think I've ever changed the setting. It just feels too jittery and jerky, and I think it's terrible quality. It's great quality video, using autofocus with it, yeah. Your autofocus mode. You know, again, this is the same thing. What's that area mode that we're working in? I'm in field right now. Those are all accessible through that quick menu. Whether your AF assist lamp is on to add a little light to your subject when you're autofocusing, I love the stealth factor of this camera and its unobtrusiveness. I generally leave that turned off unless I need it. But you saw, this is in my favorites menu. I can get there really easily. It's also on my function button menu, which I'll show you in a minute. Focus assist. This is whether or not when you go into autofocus, it magnifies the focus point that you have selected in the frame and whether it does peaking. So I'm actually going to showcase this for you really fast. I have mine set to both magnify and peak. And right now, you know, my studio's a mess. But if I pinch that little button on my manual focus wheel, it zooms in, and then as I focus, I can see little red details on things that are sharp and in focus in my scene, shifting through. All right, makes it really easy to manually focus. All right, let's get those distractions off here again. Going back into the menu, if I just press the menu quick, it takes us right where we were before. Once I go past the favorites, which is a pretty neat thing, it'll jump right to page 4 if we were in there a minute ago. It remembers that for a little bit. Still deep in this focusing thing, we had the focus assist touch to autofocus. You know, this is whether when you're working with the EVF on a tripod, say you're doing a landscape shot, you touch a spot on the tripod, does it autofocus that spot? Does it do nothing? Or does it autofocus and shoot? There are a few occasions, like say I'm focus stacking a scene out in the field and I've got a foreground, a midground, and a background, and I just want to take a shot of each and blend those to get more depth of field, say shoot it at f8 instead of f16 and have a little less diffraction, although this camera has very little diffraction at f16. Touch the foreground, touch the midground, touch the background, take a shot at each, shoot my hand before and after so I know that's a focus stacked series when I see those frames pop up in Lightroom. But in general, I just have it touch to autofocus. This is for tripod work. You know, you're touching your back LCD while you're shooting. All right, coming back out of that. Touch to autofocus in the electronic viewfinder. Or it's not touch to autofocus, it's to position the point. This is a cool thing that Sony and Canon have that Nikon does not, where while you're looking through the viewfinder, you can move the focus point around just by dragging your finger on what looks like a dead back display screen. It's pretty cool, but with this camera and the viewfinder being so close to the screen, I find my cheek is constantly moving the point to the top left when I turn it on. So I leave it not off, but in this quick setting only. Well, what does that mean? That means that if we're out here and we've touched to autofocus, and then we double tap, it takes it right to the center. That's that quick position. And so I have it set up that when I'm working through the electronic viewfinder, that touch AF and EV, the quick setting only, just double tapping the screen takes my autofocus point right to the center. It's a real quick and easy way to just center your autofocus point. You can just tap anywhere on the screen, double tap with your thumb, boop, there it is. So I leave that turned on when I'm in the EVF. That's this setting right here. Autofocus tracking start position. So this is only for that tracking mode when you're in the tracking area and you're tracking subjects that are moving through the frame. What happens is that tracking point picks something up and it'll move around the frame with the subject, you know, like the eye detect, except it's like a tracking point that grabs and takes it. So what happens when you take your finger off the shutter button to stop autofocus tracking, or the subject moves out of the frame? That's what this is asking. Where do you want that point to be once you've stopped? And the answers are whether or not you can have it in the last position, which is wherever the subject left the frame or wherever it was when you took your finger off the button. I don't find that all that useful generally. Usually, if I'm moving that tracking point off the center, it's because the race car comes through the frame from the top right to the bottom left. So I set it in the top right to pick up the car, let's say. I'm using that as an example. I lock it, it goes to the bottom of the frame, I let off, I want it to go right back there for the next car. That's recall. Center just leaves it in the center all the time. I just use recall. If I've set it somewhere, I probably did it for a reason. I want it to be back there when I'm done. And that's all your focus mode settings. It's a deep submenu. You go in there through focusing. I'll show you how we're going to put that on our function buttons list of things it can control to easily access that without going into the menus. Exposure metering. These are all the metering modes we talked about. They're in the quick, easy access menu just when you hit menu the first time. Exposure compensation. I'm going to show you how that's set by default to this wheel for me when I'm out shooting. But you can go in and change, do I want a little exposure compensation built in? I would never do it through the menu. I'll show you how I do it. ISO, again, that I have set for the function button. Tap it, boom, I can change it. Or through that quick menu setting. I would never do it here through the menu, but you can. Auto ISO settings. These can be important. What's the maximum ISO you want this camera to work at in auto ISO? I don't want 50,000 ISO. 6400 is the max that I can really work with and like and get something out of by running it through Lightroom's denoise. What's the minimum shutter speed you want the camera to go to before boosting ISO? That's a thing that might change depending on what you're shooting. If you're shooting a person, maybe you want a 60th or 120th of a second. If you're shooting a bird, maybe it's 250th of a second. If you're just hand holding a landscape, it could be a 15th of a second. I generally, in my standard mode, leave it at a 30th, but I have this easily accessible via my function button. I'll show you how in a minute so that we can get there really quick. And then it has some flash settings too. You can set these things with flash, and this is just to note, this camera will sync with flash up to 2,000th of a second with its mechanical leaf shutter, which is awesome. I leave it at 2,000. That's your max setting. White balance, again, same thing you get in that sort of quick menu setting. I would never access it here. Let's go to page 2, tap menu again. Up at the top, what file format, DNG, JPEG. JPEG settings, the resolution, a big one. What's the color management? I generally, if I'm shooting a JPEG with this camera, I'm probably gonna edit it a bit. I'd like it to be an Adobe RGB. That gives me a wider color gamut to edit in. The film style is just all those settings that are in the quick settings, standard, vivid, monochrome, high contrast monochrome. Intelligent dynamic range. This only works with JPEGs. It boosts the shadows a little bit, sort of magic like a cell phone does some computational photography. I leave it set on auto. Sometimes it gives me a little more shadow detail in my black and white JPEGs I take out of this. Scene mode. These are all these kind of automated modes. I don't think anybody using this camera is likely to use these. You would leave the camera in auto aperture, auto ISO, auto shutter speed, and you could tell that I'm shooting night, I'm shooting sports, I'm shooting snow on the beach. I've never used it. I doubt many people are. Digital zoom, that's accessible by this little button back here, sort of back behind on the body that I wish was also could control autofocus on. I'm a back button autofocuser. I think it looks like the Q3 that's coming soon might have a button like that, I'm hoping. But you can also go into the menu and you can have a little frame line while you're shooting. So you can access all the settings that are in that menu setting by pushing this little button, and you can get an equivalent of a 35mm lens frame line or a 50. It's cropping in on the sensor. At 35, you go from 47 megapixels to like 36. At 50, you go to like 24. At 75, you go to like 8 or something. Or back to 28, back to the full frame. It doesn't actually crop if you're shooting RAW. I even think if you're shooting JPEG, you bring them into Lightroom, you'll see the cropped view that you shot by default, but if you hit the crop button, the whole image is there. It shoots the whole sensor. So it's just kind of a compositional tool if you know you want to crop in, and it gives you an initial crop in Lightroom, but it doesn't actually take anything away. So let's see, that was in the digital zoom. And again, you can access those all through the menu if you were to desire to. Optical image stabilization, I just leave that on auto. It does a great job. I never turn it off. Electronic shutter. Do you want the electronic shutter to come on to give you shutter speeds up to 16,000th of a second? Yes, I do. You can turn it off or you can leave it always on. I like the mechanical shutter up to 2,000th of a second and then extended. And the mechanical shutters sounds so good. It's like it's not even there. And it's great. It enables that 2,000th of a second flash sync. Flash settings, you can go in, turn it always on, auto on, do some compensation, tell whether you want it to come in at the end of a long exposure or at the beginning. Those are some creative options you might want to change. Go into the third page of the menu. Do you want to see the effect of your settings in just program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, or would you like to see that in manual mode as well? I like to see the effects of my settings in manual mode as well. User profile. These are all those user profiles I showed you, the landscape, pano, the black and white, the face, eye detect, action, custom. These are made by me. You can, the default profile, that's that one that's factory settings essentially. We're in the custom one right now. You can see it's active. That's the one that just has the power settings turned off, the auto power off. If we go into the manage profiles, this is where this gets cool. You can save the settings that you have that you're using as a profile. And I'm gonna recommend that you go through these menus and get the camera set up the way you want it 99% of the time and save that as some sort of a standard profile. For me, I just call it standard up at the top there. You save that and then you can tweak it and resave it as new profile. So if I was to save as a profile, you can see I could go down here to custom and save it right now. I'm not going to do that because I have my profiles set the way that I want. You can rename those profiles. And I'll tell you at the end of this video how I have mine set up, how they differ from standard. But you can name them. It's as simple as jumping in here and I can put an A at the end or I can backspace. It's nice that it's a touch screen. It makes it much faster. So you can name them how you want, which is how I've done that. You can delete profiles if you don't want them anymore. You can export those profiles, which are stored in internal memory, to your memory card, which is a great idea. I keep them on a memory card here in the studio in case something went wrong with the memory card out in the field. And you can import them back off of a memory card. This is also something you should always do before you update firmware. The last firmware that brought eye detect autofocus into this camera for me nuked all my profiles. And so luckily I had them on my card and I just imported them back off the card and boom, all my settings were back. All right, so that's your manage profiles. That's an important setting within the user profile. So remember, that's all one menu setting in setting 3. You can choose what profile to be in, and you can manage profiles, which has save, rename, delete, export, and import. So coming back down here, you got some video settings. I can tell you the highest quality ones are in the movie settings. I use Cinema 4K, 24 frames a second, 10-bit, 400 megabits per second. That's really high quality. That's my favorite video setting. You can adjust your microphone's gain. This has no external microphone in port, sadly, which really limits its video capability. You got wind noise reduction and stabilization, which I always leave on. Video style, they're sort of the same as the picture styles for JPEGs, except these are going to be baked into your video and you really can't change it. There's no raw video, so you're shooting, you got to really kind of dial it in. I tend to shoot either natural or standard. Capture assistance. These are camera wide. These are whether you have a grid on while you're shooting, whether you have, which I like shooting panoramas, I'll show, and landscapes. I'll showcase that in a minute. Clipping, that shows you little blinkies when you have highlights that are blown out. Your horizon line, I showcased that earlier when we were looking. Your histogram, that's something I like to have on while I'm shooting. Again, while you're in your camera though, you can turn all that stuff off with a press of the center button on the D-pad. Boom, clean view. Just the lower settings, critical exposure settings, and whatever capture assistance you have turned on. I have the histogram and the horizon line, or all your settings and details. All right, so that's really easy. I'm gonna press menu, go into the favorites, press it again, we're right where we were. It skipped over page 1 and 2, which is cool because it remembers we were just right there. Display settings. So this you can go into and you can choose whether you want it to automatically flip from the beautiful OLED electronic viewfinder to the back LCD automatically, whether you just want to use the LCD, whether you want to use the viewfinder more than the LCD. It'll not turn the LCD on unless you hit play or menu. You just work through the viewfinder. That saves battery a little bit, or just through the viewfinder. So I generally leave it on auto, but you can change that around. Your eye sensitivity, how sensitive is it bringing your eye up? The LCD's brightness and color adjustment, EVF's brightness and color adjustment, I generally leave those on auto, but I do have this set so I can easily access it if I'm working at night and I want to dim it. Electronic viewfinder color adjustment, the frame rate, I've never changed it off 120 frames a second. I haven't seen a good reason until just now accidentally, but you can flip back and forth. I'm going to leave it at 120. Auto review, that's where you say, do I want it to interrupt my shooting and show me the image I just shot for a second or 3 seconds or 5 seconds? I do not. Some people do. No harm there. Page 4, we're kind of getting there, aren't we? Customize control. This is a biggie. We can jump in and we can set up what's on that favorites page at the beginning of the menus. You can just turn on all of the different menu options or turn them off, and you can have up to 2 pages of things there. I only have 1 page that I found I really needed. You can say I want auto ISO settings to be there or not be there, just as simple as that. Boom. So you can roll through everything. So again, when I have my menu set up, it's the favorites menus are auto ISO settings, flash settings, video settings, capture assistance, display settings like we were just in, format my memory card. That's all I've really found that I need in those custom favorites. You can have 2 pages if you want. You can add more stuff, but then you have to just get through it to get to the rest of the menu. The function button. I was telling you a minute ago, right now I have mine set to where it's ISO. I can change it off of auto and pick an ISO given the situation. But I can also long press it and choose from up to 8 options. I only have 7 I've found in the menus that I want to have there. I can change my interval shooting settings. We'll look at those in a second. Exposure bracketing, focusing, that's all those focus mode settings. If I tap function button now, it takes me right there. So long press again, and go back to the ISO I normally keep there. Those auto ISO settings, in case I want to change that minimum shutter speed or the maximum ISO setting. Your flash settings and video format and resolution. I generally leave it here on ISO. You want to leave it on the setting you want when you save your profile because it's going to remember where it was. And now tap it and I'm back in my ISO. But you can access all those by a long press. It's super cool. All right, and that again was here in that customize control function button, and I can go through and turn things on and off just like I did in the favorites menu. The right wheel button, identical. Okay, it's the same thing. When I'm shooting, tap it, I'm in exposure compensation that easily, but long press it and I can choose instead to be controlling self-timer. Tap it, I'm choosing my self-timer settings. Boom, boom, boom. The other things I have on there, I leave it on ISO or on exposure compensation. I have ISO because it's really easy to access while shooting, and sometimes I might just want to be able to grab ISO there too. So Gray Card is this really cool feature where I can take a color checker. This is a X-Rite color checker passport. I can take a little gray card, whatever kind of gray card you have, and if I set this in my camera for that function wheel and set that gray card in front of my camera, just get it out there in the light and conditions that I'm working in and take the shutter shot, it's going to create a white balance right for the particular light and scene that I'm working in. And so now when I take a look at my quick settings, instead of auto white balance, we're here on the gray card white balance. It's that easy. I love having that on my wheel function button. And we can just touch there and we can go back into whatever the other autofocus you might want. But you know, for right now, that works great. So we're white balanced for this scene here in my studio, just that easily. I long press the button again. Microphone gain is the other thing I've got. Since you don't have an external mic in, having microphone gain on that wheel button can be handy if you are shooting video and you want to get any kind of decent audio. So jumping back into the customized control, beyond the right wheel button and the function button and the favorites that we can set up, you know, again, it's just as easy as running through the whole list of menu options and turning on the ones you want there. Going to wheel assignment, that's whether or not you want this wheel to automatically do different functions depending on what mode you're in. You can turn the wheel button off. You can have it be just auto exposure compensation or exposure compensation all the time. I tend to like to leave it on auto. That way, if you're doing manual shutter speeds, it automatically selects those third stops between shutter speed or goes down to 122nd off the 1+ setting. It just, the Leica, you can tell how long I've been shooting Nikon. The Leica engineers have done an amazing job making this wheel do exactly what you want it to do depending on what situation you're in. And then if you want to take control over what it's doing, you know, it's as simple as long pressing it and saying, I want that button to be ISO. There it goes. All right. I don't particularly want it to be there. I want it to be exposure compensation. Bam. All right, so going into menu again, we're still in customized control. The zoom and lock button. So that's that little zoom button here on the back that chooses whether you're cropping in on the sensor a little bit. And again, doesn't actually, it's a digital zoom, but it doesn't do away. You always got those extra pixels if you want to recrop it differently in Lightroom afterwards or whatever your image processor of choice is. You can also have that button lock, autofocus, and exposure compensation, or just auto exposure. I mean, not exposure, just lock the metering on a particular part of the scene and then recompose, or lock autofocus and recompose, or one or the other. Sadly, it won't automatically do autofocus. It won't be back button autofocus. Again, the Q3 looks like it has a second button, and I'm hoping that that enables that. I just leave it on the digital zoom setting. All right. So that's our customized controls. Leica photos, that's to sync up and link up pair your phone and your camera. Pretty cool. Edit your file name. I just have it be Q. That way I know it's from the Leica Q. Reset your image numbering, you can do that. Power saving, I have that all turned off right now in my custom profile. If I was to jump for a second here at the risk of the camera auto shutting off while we're working, and I went into my standard mode, and then I went back into the menu and looked at power saving. I have it set to go into power saving mode in 10 seconds and power off in 2 minutes and turn all the displays off in a minute. You know, that's my general sort of preference to save battery. So if I screw up and leave the camera on, it doesn't just burn the entire battery out. Oh, oops, I hit the wrong thing. I want to go into my profiles, and I'm going to go back to that custom so that we don't time out. And then I'll hit menu and jump back into level 4. Acoustic signal, that is the camera squawking at you and making noises while you're working with it. I turn the volume to low and then turn all those acoustic signals off personally. Some people like some confirmation of autofocus or settings, but I just turn it all off. The play mode setup, group display mode, that's for if you're shooting burst mode, high speed continuous, high speed low, you know, high speed very fast, whatever. If you shoot bursts of images, they'll kind of come in as a group, so that when you hit play, it shows you that whole group, and then you can jump in and look at individual images within the group by hitting the center button and explore each one of those images and mark some of those if you want as starred. Or do you want to see clipping? Do you want to see a histogram? Yes. I have all those things set to yes. I like them all. When I hit play, I can see the histogram, I can see blinkies if I'm clipping. So, you know, I can turn all that off and just look at the image with the press of the center button. So, pretty cool stuff. Going into the menu, going to menu. Format the memory card. I'm not going to do that right now. I don't have all these images downloaded. But you saw I put that in my favorites section so that I could access it without it going all the way to page 4. It's something I do pretty frequently. Camera information, that just gives you a lot of details about the camera and what firmware you're running. Date and time settings, language settings, reset the camera to factory defaults. Not going to do that right now. Pixel mapping, that's looking for dead pixels. You know, sometimes you're looking through your images and you'll see that every single image has a little green speck or a red speck or a blue speck or a white speck. That's just a pixel that's gone bad out of all those millions of pixels. And the camera will automatically pixel map itself, and if it sees a dead pixel, it'll average the pixels around it and fill that gap. But if you see it happening, and I think it only does it every 2 weeks by default internally, you can tell it to pixel map right now and get rid of that. If you're going through your images and you see it's happening, you can run it yourself. All right, so that's the menus, from the quick menu to the favorites menu to the settings for the function buttons. The one thing I want to talk briefly about is just how I have the camera set up. So with my profiles. All right, really quick, I'm going to run through and I'm going to talk about the different profiles that I use to quickly change the camera from one type of shooting to another. It just alters all the stuff in the menu structure to be ready to go for some different types of scenes. And as I said, you know, these are for me. They may not be your settings, just like my menu settings may not be your settings, but hopefully you'll get some help just by thinking about how I have mine set up. And again, you know, to change and save these profiles, you go into the menu on page 3, user profile. You can either select which one you're working with. Right now we're in that custom one that keeps me from having the power saver turn the camera off. You go into the manage profiles, and once you get your settings all dialed in the way you want, including what your function button and wheel button are currently set to control, save it as a profile. And I have mine sort of standard settings set as standard. And I'll go through how these are shifted. You can name them right here. Again, you go in and you can type it on the touch screen. So it's that simple. You can save and import. You can import and export those to the memory card to save them for later. You can delete them. All right, so if we go into our menu and we hit that quick setting, your profile's right there. I'm on the custom profile. There is that one that's the default profile. That's just setting the camera to factory defaults. If I go into my standard, it's set with all the settings you saw me do in the menu with autofocus single servo, so it locks focus, it's not tracking, and it's with the field autofocus point. It's auto white balance, it's just shooting a raw file. It's in the multi-field exposure mode, so it's really looking at your subject and exposing for your subject. Standard picture mode, not vivid or black and white, and a single frame at a time. It's really that simple. And all the menu settings that we went through and my preferences I told you about, and what's going on with my function button being ISO, my wheel button being exposure compensation, that's all right there. Just accessible with that. I lock it in, I save it. Okay, then I take that and I change it a little bit for landscape and panorama. Well, how do I change it? I change to that spot autofocus, so that when I'm focusing, I have that little tiny point that's very, very accurate. I changed from that multi-field metering into highlight weighted. I want that to be protecting me from blowing out highlights. Still single frame, still standard DNG, still standard picture mode. I'm shooting raw. If I go into 3 is a black and white mode, and all it really changes for me is off my standard. Standard, again, has that multi-field metering. It's really looking at my subject. It'll let the highlights go to keep my subject well exposed. It's still in the field mode. The only things I really change for the black and white mode are that I'm in the picture mode monochrome, and I'm shooting a large JPEG plus DNG. You know, if I want to shoot black and whites of people, I can quickly jump in here and change my focusing mode to be on eye and face detect and go into autofocus continuous, and boom, there I am. You know, if I want to go back to my standard black and white and have all those settings revert, boom, there I am, I'm back. It's that quick and that easy. This is really powerful stuff. I jump into face and eye detect. All it is off the standard setting really is autofocus continuous, and it's going to jump into eye and face detect. So it's tracking eyes and faces. That's new stuff that's available with this firmware. I leave it in the multi-field because it's focused on my subject. You know, I can change any other settings that I want. One thing I do change in this is I go into my ISO settings here, and I have them set to be, oh sorry, not ISO settings, but the ISO, auto ISO settings. And I have those set to be a shutter speed of a 60th of a second for people. I don't want to drop below a 60th of a second, or I'm going to have blurry people if they move a little bit. So I could always change that. It's as easy to get to as long pressing this button. I'll go back to my standard sort of ISO setting. And then going back in here, the next profile is action. Action is for shooting moving subjects, you know, the things that are moving fast. It tracks them with that tracking mode. And I use AFC. That's really the only change. I'm still in that multi-field metering. I can change any of these settings that I want. It also changes me to be in continuous high-speed burst mode. And I have my auto ISO settings shifted on this to be 1/250th of a second. I don't want to have my subjects blurred if I'm in auto ISO. So there you go. And so if I jump back into my menu and I look at the last one's custom, that I can just change given any kind of scene that I might encounter. Say I'm doing something different than normal, I can set up my own mode. So if I go back into the standard mode, you know, one thing I didn't talk about were those settings that we locked in for interval shooting and exposure bracketing. You know, before you lock in any settings, I like in my standard setting to have the exposure bracketing set that if I activate that, it's shooting 3 frames, 3 stops apart, no exposure compensation built in, and it's automatically firing all 3 frames when I press the shutter button. It's pretty crazy, I think, that you can take 5 frames 3 stops apart with this camera. I love that. So you can shoot 6 stops under, 3 stops under, on the meter, 3 stops over, 6 stops over. But for most scenes, to get high dynamic range, natural looking images, 3 stops under on the meter, 3 stops over. Like this image I'm showing right now from Viñales and my good friend Chap Jackson shooting at dawn, this beautiful place in Cuba last month. Sun rising behind him, no strobe lights whatsoever, just captured this way. 3 under on the meter, 3 over, totally did it. Now again, I want to go back into ISO as my main setting there. The other one, quickly we'll talk about, is interval shooting. Your settings in that, you can easily get how many frames. This is I usually use for time lapse. What's your interval apart? You know, you're gonna set that up to shoot 240 frames, 2 seconds apart, and then you do the rest of the math. You can have a countdown to start it if you want. Simple stuff. So hopefully that helps some of you who've newly acquired a Q2 or someone who's just been sort of shooting it without realizing all the depth and power that this camera has. It really blends the modern with some of the best of old school cameras. I adore it. I can't be without it. The Q3 is coming. I'll soon do a video talking about what's different with the Q3, and I'll do another setup video for the Q3. I'm still primarily a Nikon shooter, but I love to see what all the other companies are doing. And I think this is just an amazing, amazing time to be a photographer. And I have had, I don't know, 5 or 6 of my regular workshop aficionados, my frequent flyers, watch me shoot with this camera, see the results from this camera, and purchase their own. And we had, I don't know, 5 of them in Cuba on the 2 different workshops. And everybody universally loves this little camera. Yes, it's expensive, but it's unrivaled in what it makes possible in carrying a small form factor fixed frame camera around with you. I adore it, and I can't wait for the Q3. So if you have comments, hit me up. You can always email me, get a hold of me. I watch these comments. Again, links to all the accessories that I recommend are in this video's full description along with the chapter.table of contents. I appreciate your sharing, liking, subscribing to the channel. There'll be more Leica content alongside all the Nikon content, and also news about Sony, Canon, Fuji, whoever else is doing interesting things. All things photographic are fair game. So hope you enjoyed. I hope to see you out there with your Leica. I sure love mine. Thanks again. I hope you're staying safe, staying creative. We'll see you next video.